introduce today's speaker and his wife, Bill and Betty Buhler. Betty's over here. Moved here in 1956. They raised 3 children, 2 of whom are here. All 3 of them were raised through the public school system. Bill was real clear about wanting to include that in the orientation. Bill was a lawyer in TRC for at least 40 years and is now retired, but is still actively engaged in many ways. He was a city commissioner for 4 years at one point, and so he's involved in civic responsibilities in great ways. And then he also was, for 11 years, was the chairman of the board of directors of the Geronimo Springs Museum in its very beginning days, and was, as I've had it told to me, was really or maybe if not the driving force in the creation of the museum. So in terms of the lovely completing of a circle of the new efforts being done to record and enjoy history, here we have somebody who really was there at the beginning of preserving history in TRC. So without any more, I'm just going to introduce Bill Buhler.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Thank you for the nice introduction. My wife, Betty, is here today. We've been married for 67 years. Betty was Miss Mankato in Mankato, Minnesota, when she was 19 years old, and she became a school teacher here in the 4th grade. Also, I'd like to introduce my daughter Susan and her sister Wendy. They're here today. They both graduated from Hot Springs High School, and I'm very proud of both of them. I did have a son too, William, named after me. He was a school teacher in Alamogordo for 26 years, and he had colon cancer without realizing it, and by the time it was diagnosed, it was in the 4th stage, and he lasted about 3 months. He'll be gone 3 years this 3rd day of next month. I'm going to be 90 in January 31st. We came to Truth or Consequences in the summer of 1956, and I worked for another attorney up on Main Street for a year. And one morning, we were renting the residence that Terry Miller and his wife have on Arrowhead Drive. And one morning, Susan and I, she was about, I'd say 4 years old at the time, took a little walk down Riverside Drive. And Dr. Maloney had a residence along the river, and he had some peacocks out in his front yard that he raised. They sounded a lot like a woman in peril when they cried. We talked with Dr. Maloney for a while. I told him I'd love to get a place on the river, and he said, "Well, look at that house right down the road there." And he was describing quite a nice place, a greenhouse. "Oh," I said, "I couldn't afford a place like that." "Yes," he said, "you'd be surprised how reasonably it's priced." He said, "I'd buy it myself, but I can't get my wife to agree to it." Well, ultimately, I did get that residence. We've been living in that same house for over 60 years. I'll tell you a little side story about that residence. We had a dog named Cinders. And my wife, when she went to work each morning as a 4th grade school teacher, would drive a Jeep that we were using that belonged to the employer that I worked for. And we had a dog named Cinders. He would follow Betty for at least a mile behind the Jeep, and she would go into the school, which was then in the Energy Building, where the treasurer and assessor and county clerk are located. Cinders would crawl underneath the Jeep, and he would sit there all day long while Betty was teaching. And after the day's work was finished, Betty would open the door and he would get inside the Jeep, and they'd ride back to the house together. And that's quite a dog that would do that. Get underneath the Jeep, follow her to work, get under the Jeep, and sit there all day long waiting for her to come back from work and let him inside. Incidentally, in addition to that, he did raise my 3 kids, all 3 of them. My first law office that I opened was in the theater building up on Main Street, where the theater is located. I was in that little office, and it wasn't really any bigger than this room and that room right next to us combined, with a little bathroom behind it. And I was in that building for about a year, and then an attorney named Nils Kellstrom decided to retire, and he offered to let me purchase his library and equipment and so forth. And so I moved from the one side of the theater building to the other side of the theater building where his office was, and it was quite nice. And I was there for about a year or 2, and my telephone number was number 2. And in those days, the bank's telephone number was number 1. So I had a very prominent telephone number, which was the one that he had in his office. Well, after a period of time, there was a man that approached me. His name was Dutch Walls. He had a insurance agency called Wall Stewart, and he told me about a couple buildings that were for sale, and he thought maybe I'd like to purchase them with him as a partnership. And the price was good. The 2 buildings, total price was $3,000. They were located in the where the present law office of J. Rubin is, and next door where the Lucchini Electric office formerly was. So we bought the 2 buildings together, had them for about a year vacant, and then I decided I would like to acquire one of the buildings and remodel it as a law office. So we decided that the Lucchini building was the better of the 2, the bigger, and it had a basement, a full basement, and upstairs. So I gave $1,000 for my building, and Dutch's building that he kept he valued it at $2,000. So I now had the ownership of 418 Main Street. The building had been vacant for a while, and I hired a good contractor, and we spent, I'd say at least 6 months completely remodeling the building as a law office. And I moved into that at that time, and but before that happened, I got a telephone call one day from a man named Robert Smith, and he said, we have just purchased the bank on Main Street, Hot Springs National Bank, and we wondered if you'd like to be the attorney for us for the bank. Well, at the time I was about 58 years old. I didn't have a gray hair on my head, and usually you had to be at least 55 or 60 years old to be attorney for the bank. So here I was, very young, and it was a great opportunity. My wife had started teaching to help us make ends meet, because starting out as a beginning lawyer was very slow. And so she was teaching, and I got this opportunity to be attorney for the only bank in town. Now, at that time, the bank was located up on in the building that is now peach-colored, but it was purple for a while. The vault is still inside, and that was the Hot Springs National Bank. Well, that was a great opportunity for a young guy, 28 years old, without a gray hair in his head. Well, after a couple of years, I had the opportunity to become to join the board of directors of the bank, and that was about the time that I decided to remodel the building on at 418 Main Street. Well, the next thing that I did there was a new person bought the bank building. His name was Bill Galloway. He was a wild fellow, quite a drinker to boot, and he decided he'd like to have a new bank building. His brother, Press Galloway, had a construction company over in Texas, and they brought the bricks from Texas, and the James apartment and bathhouse was purchased down on Broadway Street. It was on across the street from City Hall, and on one side, on the back side, and on the front side, Wall Stewart, the Davis Fleck drugstore was across the street on Broadway. It was a beautiful, of course we had to tear down the bathhouse and apartment building. And it was a beautiful new bank building put up on Broadway. The next thing that I was involved in was the Geronimo Springs Museum. But before that, in 1959 and 60, I was on the board of directors of the local Chamber of Commerce. The man that had been president he was a obstetrician, and the chamber was in pretty bad shape. It was located in the building it's in now, but it had about $2,300 indebtedness. It owed its secretary almost $2,000 in back salary. Her name is Helga Latham, and Dr. Bussimus's idea was to close the chamber. He said it's the membership has dwindled down to almost nothing, and his advice was, let's close it down. Well, I was on the board, and I hated to see the chamber close up. So I said to the board, I would be willing to take over the job of president, provided the board members here would agree, put their hands up and agree that they would work as hard as I would work to get the chamber going again. And they did. They all agreed to do this. Well, we started out, this was in 1959, we started out by reorganizing the time period of membership. Starting in January, we started in July, and our goal was to get 100 members that would pay $6,000 a year in dues. And we had a thermometer set up by the hospital of people that would join up. It became kind of a pressure deal. And at the time we had 2 newspapers, and we had the thermometer with the names in the newspaper. Well, we got the goal met, we got the money, we paid off the secretary in full, and we established a pretty for the chamber, including improvements at the lake. We wanted to get the roads paved out at the lake, the main highway. Up to then, the only paving out there was to the old marina by the dam, and there was no other paving at Elephant Butte. So we got that going on, and the next thing that I began working on was the Geronimo Springs Museum. Now the idea and the vision for that museum belonged to a man named Hal Everett. He was the city manager here, and his idea was to build a new museum where the springs is, and I'll divert a little bit in my story. There was a man named Robert Martin. He became owner of the bank in later years, but his first time in TRC was on horseback. He was riding in the area where the Veterans Center is, looking back over his shoulder, and this was about 1914. Looking back over his shoulder, it might have been a little earlier than that. There was not a single building in Truth or Consequences except for what looked like an Indian hut in the area where the spring is. And there was a man, a white man, a Caucasian man, that had just gotten out of the spring, standing there in the nude. And Bob Martin looked out over his shoulder at this man. He was probably a quarter of a mile away. And here he was standing by the spring in the nude. He'd just taken a warm spring bath. And he was the only man in town. And there was no buildings in town. And Bob Martin was on horseback. He later acquired ownership of the bank in Hot Springs. That's another story. But Hal Everett had the vision for building a new museum in Truth or Consequences, and he even had the name in mind. It was going to be called the Geronimo Springs Museum. Now, the next thing that happened on the museum was we had a Rotary Club meetings in what was called Shadow Hills Restaurant in the front part of the old Buena Vista Hotel up on an extension of Main Street. We were sitting in a club room setting with the Rotary Club, and the program for the day was Hal Everett. And he had a portrait of Geronimo standing holding a rifle, and he was offering to sell tickets on that painting to use to begin the construction of the new museum. And he had already raised about, I'm going to say maybe $200 with tickets. And I was sitting at a table with about 5 other Rotarians around me, and there were other separate tables like that. And I turned to the people at the table and I said, would each of you be willing to pledge $200 if we got a museum like this envisioned by Mr. Everett started? And there were like 5 people around the table, and they all said, sure, we'd do that, $200. They were businessmen. I said, well, counting me, we've got 6 people here. That's $1,200. This man had raised $200 selling chances on the painting, and all of a sudden we had put together a plan of $1,200. Well, the next thing that happened toward the museum was we had a Christmas party by the telephone company. And I was the attorney for the telephone company for New Mexico, and it had an office in TRC, and the manager lived in TRC. So he had an annual Christmas party. I was invited, and Betty. And I thought this would be a good opportunity to extend my promotional idea for the museum. So I would go around to the different people at the party and ask if they would consider making a pledge of $200 for a new museum. And universally, the people all thought it was good and agreed to do it. Well, there were probably 50 people at that party at least, maybe more than that. You could see what at $200 a whack that added up to that night. Now there was one downside to the deal. The state owner of the telephone company didn't appreciate my efforts of fundraising at his Christmas party, and I lost my job. But the museum did make some good progress there. Now the next thing I did is I invited a man to come to TRC. His name was Jack Rittenhouse, and he was president of the Historical Society of New Mexico. We met in what was called the Gold Room of the Lahanatola Bathhouse, which is now owned by Ted Turner as his facility. And he had a room, not Ted Turner, but the owner did, of the bathhouse, called the Gold Room. And that's where we met with Jack Rittenhouse and members of the Rotary Club that I thought would be helpful in getting this museum started if we got a board of directors set up and so forth. Jack Rittenhouse was very helpful. He told us we should form a nonprofit New Mexico corporation, and we should have a board of directors, and we needed a fundraising drive to continue, and we needed to buy property. And then he gave us some suggestions on what we should put inside the museum. So this is a good plan, and he also said we should get in touch with the director of the museum in Santa Fe, the New Mexico Museum. Well, we did that, and he came down, the director did, and he said this: I'm going to make this activity that you've got going on in Truth and Consequences a pilot project for the state of New Mexico. And if we can get a new museum started for you in TRC, it can be used to help other museum ideas in towns in New Mexico to get started. He said, we'll make this kind of a pilot project. And he said, when you're ready, I can send my crew down to TRC and help set up the interior of the museum and the displays. And he said there'll be no charge in our doing that. And he did that. He sent a crew down of about 5 men for over a week or 10 days, and we had 2 buildings at that time. The first 2 buildings were the offices of Dr. A.C. White. He had a medical building, and next to it was the former building occupied by the city of TRC as a city hall. It was vacant, and so was Dr. White's building vacant. We bought the 2 buildings, and incidentally, I didn't introduce Andy Underwood earlier. I should have. He is the new husband of my daughter Susan, and Andy's father was on the board of directors of this new corporation, and he helped with the fundraising. We had a contest going on between Dave and I of who would get the most at the 200. Now, he was president of the bank, so he was good competition for me to take on. But we raised, between us, we raised $40,000. We had over 200 members at $200 each, and then we had major contributors, and that included Ralph Edwards. It included Betty and Bill Buhler. It included the Hot Springs Women's Club and D.W. Falls at the lake. They were at the top of the plaque, the major contributors, 2,000 or more, and the regular contributors, 200, each had a place on the plaque with their name. And the Rotary Club paid for the plaque. It was a beautiful plaque placed in the museum, engraved by Ray Crooks, who had a jewelry shop here. So we had the two first buildings were our beginning. And we moved into them with the help of the Santa Fe Museum. And it was a wonderful dedication. And the next thing that happened was I got the idea of having Ralph Edwards involved at the museum. And I telephoned Ralph and asked him if he would like to acquire the next building over to the museum, which was a boarding house. I said it can be acquired for $5,000. Ralph sent Ed Bailey to TRC, who was his production manager. He was from Minneapolis originally, and I was from St. Paul. So we were kind of kindred spirits. We had a nice dinner at the house. Betty put on a prime rib dinner for Ed Bailey, and he looked at the building. He recommended to Ralph to do it, and Ralph sent me a check for $5,000, and we bought the building. And I contacted the museum in Santa Fe. They had a new director now. It's a lady. And she said, well, we've helped before your museum down there. She said, I'm going to send a crew down and we'll display the Ralph Edwards memorabilia in this new wing. Now, Ralph Edwards had been decorated by 5 presidents of the United States. He was the man that introduced the media for raising funds for charity, Ralph Edwards. He's not well known for that activity, but he was decorated and recognized and cited by 5 United States presidents, beginning with Dwight D. Eisenhower. And so we had his entire collection of memorabilia in the Geronimo Springs Museum. Now, the next thing that happened to us, I got a telephone call from a lady who had a doll shop across the street, a doll museum across the street from the museum. She had hundreds of dolls in this museum. And she said, Mr. Buhler, the hippies are using a building next door to the Ralph Edwards wing. And she said they have it as a stopping place cross-country. And she said they're going to ruin the museum if they get hold and buy that building. They're just using it now. She said the museum has got to stop this. It's going to ruin the museum. Well, Elizabeth Ebeling owned a building called the Turf Bar, and this was the building. And I called her up. I said, Elizabeth, would you come down to the office? She did. I said, Elizabeth, have you made a deal with the people that are in there for the, I won't say the word again. And she said, they are talking about wanting to buy it, but we haven't settled on anything at this point at all. I said, would you consider selling the building to the museum? Yes, she said, I would. I said, how much money would you need, Elizabeth? She said, $5,000. I said, well, what would the down payment be? Well, she said, to the museum, there'd be no down payment necessary. Well, what would the interest rate be in the monthly payment? She said, interest at 6% and a monthly payment of $50 a month. I said, Elizabeth, put your head out. You just sold the building. So we had the building. It was vacant, of course. It had a big bar in it, and it had been the turf bar. I tried the hardest way in the world to develop the building. I didn't have it. I went to different places here in town, the Hobby Club, different organizations. I just struck out. I was just at a loss of what to do with the building. And then a good thing happened. The bicentennial in New Mexico. Now, the bicentennial had a plan of offering money to communities if they would celebrate the bicentennial in New Mexico. That's the 400th year of the United States. And so we, at the museum, decided that we'd like to apply for a grant of $3,500 from the bicentennial, and would use the money for that building. The group came to Tiersee, and we met with them in the museum. They looked at the museum. They liked it. They liked the idea of what we were going to do. And the plan was this. We were going to celebrate the 4 cultures that had created New Mexico: the Indian, the Spanish, the Mexican, and the Anglo. And we would feature these 4 cultures in the new building with the money that we got from the bicentennial grant of $3,500. Now, the lake had a plan for the money, too. They were going to have a regatta, a one-time event. Well, the Bicentennial Commission thought our plan would be more of a lasting benefit than a one-time regatta, and they gave us the money. Now, the next thing I did is I went to Delmas Howe, which you all know Delmas. Delmas was a celebrated painter at the time, and he had done murals at the Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs. And I had been a hunting partner of his father, Roy Howe. We hunted together. In fact, one time we took Susan out hunting with us, and we got a nice deer together, the 3 of us. So I said to Delmas, would you be willing to paint 4 murals for this new wing in the museum if we furnish the canvas and the paint? And you would do this in dedication, as a tribute to your parents. Delmas said, yes, I will do that. And so he came here, and he and I went together with Betty, and we looked at different settings that we could have for these 4 murals. We went up to Ojo Caliente, where Geronimo had escaped and been held a prisoner, and took pictures of the beautiful box walls there in the canyon. And we went over to Palomas, Mexico, and had lunch, and we took pictures where Pancho Villa had attacked the United States at Columbus. Took pictures there. And from these pictures, Delmas developed the 4 murals. And they were magnificent, of course. They took him a long time to paint. But I still didn't have anybody to work on the room. So what we did it ourselves. The board of directors of the Hot Springs, of the Geronimo Springs Museum, plus Betty, plus my son Bill, went down to the new wing every week, and we worked on that building, for like 4 or 5 hours every week, under the direction of Art Selleck, who was a local contractor. Lucchini Electric did the electrical work for free. We got the tiles for the ceiling from the new bank that we had built across the street. We had torn down the doll museum and the bathhouse, and in the ceiling of one of the buildings were the beautiful metal tiles. We put them in the new wing. It was a dirty job doing this. There was a stove in there that had to be taken out, like a fireplace, and it had heated the upstairs, and we wore masks when we worked on taking that thing apart because it had been there for 50 years. Very dirty work. And we finished it. It took us, I'd say probably a year, so we had a beautiful dedication for that new wing. And a lady by the name of Leindecker, she was on the board of directors of, at that time, Carrie Tingley Crippled Children Hospital, and she did the bronze heads. She was a sculptress, and she didn't charge for that. We paid for the material. Then the last part of the museum was the log cabin, and the Forest Service said they would give us a log cabin for $1 a year if we wanted to move it to the museum. Well, I had a friend, Cloyd Beale. He had done a lot of work for me up at Poverty Creek, which is a mountain property I had. And he and I went in the Jeep up in the Black Range looking at some old log cabins. We looked at one in Chloride Canyon, but it was pretty well shot. And then we found a nice one up on the Adobe Ranch in the forest, and decided that would be the best one. And I said, Cloyd, what would you charge to move this cabin, take it apart, move it down, if I furnished a trailer and set it up at the museum? He said, I'll do that for $1,750, Bill. I said, Cloyd, you got a deal. So he and his wife, Ruby, together, under the close supervision of the Forest Service every step of the way, they took that cabin completely apart, brought it to town, reconstructed it at the museum. But we didn't have a connection from the museum to the cabin, just an open air. I said, Cloyd, there's a bathroom up there, an outdoor privy at where the cabin was. I said, we need to take that down, Cloyd, and bring it down to town and use that lumber. It was beautiful, old, 50, 100-year-old lumber. And Cloyd said, I'll do that too, and I don't know what the charge was. And not too many people know that we used the lumber from that toilet to connect the Geronimo Springs Museum with the log cabin. But it looks very nice. All right, now let's see what we've got here left.
Does anybody have any questions?
Well, I've got a couple more things before we get to that.
Okay. All right.
Now, the new bank. After the museum was finished, I had left the services of the other bank and decided that it would be helpful for the town to have a second bank. And so I put together a group of people, and we formed a New Mexico banking corporation. we acquired land across the street from the museum, where the doll museum was, and the bathhouse. And we tore those properties down. We hired an architect and a contractor, and sold stock for the new bank. And then we built the new bank, and my son Bill helped. We put a temporary banking quarters in the bathhouse across from the. It was just temporary, but it worked all right for about a year while we were building the new bank. And then we had a grand opening, and that bank today is the Compass Bank. And I was the chairman of the board of it for the first several years, and the organizer of the bank. Now, the next project that I took on was next door, and that's the old, what's called the Santa Fe. It was the Santa Fe Bus Depot, and that's where the Boys and Girls Club is today. Now, that building was 8,000 square feet, and you could go inside and look up and see the sky. But it was well built. It was built like an army fort by the Santa Fe Railroad. And they had a bus depot in the front part, and in the back part they had a delivery thing where they would deliver things that were going to be shipped around southern New Mexico from that terminal. And the building had about 5,000 square feet in the front for the bus depot and restaurant, and about 3,000 feet in the back for the terminal part. Well, we contacted the Santa Fe Railroad, and they said we were willing to sell the building, make us an offer. Frank Lucchini and I made him an offer. It went up before the board of directors of the Santa Fe Railroad, and they sold us the building. Well, the front part we remodeled and made into offices for the welfare department, and the back part we remodeled and made into offices for the health department. And next door here we had the welfare department and health department for about 15 years. Wow. And then they moved, and eventually we sold that to the Boys and Girls Club, who are the owner. Now, there was one other building project that I had, and Dave Underwood and I worked on that. It was the building at 303 Main. Johnny Downs, at the time, was with the Forest Service, and he told Dave Underwood and myself that they were looking for rental property in Tier C. So we bought what had been Dr. Scott's medical building and an insurance office next door, and we remodeled that building for the Forest Service. And then Dave and I and Johnny Downs, we dissolved the partnership we had, and we had a little ranch, about 8 sections around Williamsburg, in that area. And Dave and Johnny took the ranch, and I took the building at 303 Main, and continued to lease it to the Forest Service, and later to the Motor Vehicle Department, and later to insurance office, and later to Dish TV. And then we sold the building to Susan, and Susan now has it as 303 Main Gallery. I'm just about finished this little presentation. What time is it?
About 5 to 12.
Is it 12 o'clock yet?
Almost 5 minutes.
5 minutes. All right, the last thing that I've got on here was last year, Betty and I set up a nonprofit New Mexico corporation called Poverty Creek Pines Conservancy. It's located, the land that we deeded to the conservancy was land up at Poverty Creek, New Mexico. Some of you know where that is, in the Black Range.
Right.
Now, another man and I acquired a homestead up there with an old 1880 log cabin built on it, and we sold off part of the property to a El Paso attorney by the name of Tom Diamond. He's a book writer, and he started the Tigua Indian development in El Paso, and he bought off part of the land on the west side of the highway for enough money to pay for the entire property. And then my partner became a friend named Babe Lanford. I let him into the deal. I put up the money for the purchase in the beginning, and I made him a 50-50 partner without him putting any money into the pot. And we became partners for about 30 years, developing Poverty Creek. But we retained the bottom part where the log cabin and the creek flowed because of the possibility of flooding. And last year, Betty and I, we deeded that log cabin part and the running creek part, about 9 acres, to the Conservancy. It's a forever nonprofit corporation, and the purpose of it is to improve the quality of life at Poverty Creek. And so we've got this new conservancy set up with a board of directors, and it's looking after the property up at Poverty Creek after Betty and I are gone. And so my time, I've received a plaque, incidentally, a couple of years ago from the state bar for being a practicing lawyer for 50 years in Tier C. So my years of being a lawyer and my developing of property in the Tier C and area have been an exciting time for me, and I want to thank you for this opportunity to come and tell the story of some of my activities here over the past 60 years. Like I said, I'll be 90 next month, so it's been a good trip for me here, and I've enjoyed it a lot. The town has changed considerably during that time period. The one thing I didn't mention is while I was on the city commission, they were doing the bypass, and we wanted the downtown to be improved also when they did the approach into town, and they said they would do it if we made it one way, Main Street and Broadway. So the city commission I was on at the time voted to make it one-way street, and so they redid the downtown as part of that development. So that's it. Are there any questions before we adjourn? Have I worn you out completely? Yes, sir.
Now going back to that street, Main and Broadway, we walk that every other day. I think the speed limit is too high. Why? If you cross that, you gotta be very careful. One guy will stop and the other guy over there don't see that why he's walking or stopped, and you almost get hit.
You know, that's still part of the state of New Mexico, and I think they probably regulate the speed limit.
Right. Needs to be brought to the state. I have a question.
Yes, sir.
The contractor that did the bank, do you remember his name?
Yes, Press Galloway.
Press Galloway. He was the contractor?
He was the contractor and builder
Okay.
who did the new bank building on Broadway.
Okay.
Yes.
Great.
He's still alive.
Is he? Okay.
Wow.
Yes.
So you came here from Minnesota, right?
Well, not directly. I grew up in St. Paul. I went to law school at the University of Minnesota, and then I was commissioned in the Korean War in the Navy. And then I finished law. I got a degree at Minnesota from law school, and I got a second degree in Albuquerque.
Okay, well, here's my question.
And then I moved down here.
So, where do you think that spirit you have within you and your wife for civic development, civic interest, civic spirit that you seem to have brought here, or maybe it's just native in you, but where do you think that comes from?
I know the answer to that.
Okay.
Our family is very old. Dad's first ancestry came in 1635 from England. And through that line, the Ives family, we have a long, industrious history of people who gave, who contributed to the creation of the United States. Dad is very much a son of all of his ancestors. They were builders, they were pioneers, they were entrepreneurs. We had a famous inventor in the family, U.S. postage stamp. He's right up there with Edison, Lumiere, and Laguerre. And Dad is very much in that spirit. He's an old soul. He's always been community-minded.
Well, thank you, Wendy. There's a wonderful story about my great-grandfather. His name was C.D. Ives. He went to the gold rush in Colorado, and he came back to his home in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in rags, penniless. And his wife, Ellen Dale, said to him, "I have hand-knit you a suit of clothing. You go down to the railroad, they are laying on hands." He did, and through hard work and many years of service, he became president of the railroad. He extended the railroad and doubled the size of it. He extended it into Chicago, and it went from Chicago into Iowa, Burlington, Cedar Rapids, and then it went into Minnesota. And a city in Minnesota was named after his wife, Ellen Dale, who made the suit of clothing for him. And it's called Ellendale, Minnesota. And then the railroad continued into the South and North Dakota. But he started working there with nothing, and I went back to Cedar Rapids about 2 years ago because the family mausoleum that he had constructed for his wife Ellen Dale had been the victim of some flooding in Cedar Rapids. And my brother and I put together a fund of money, and we hired a family contractors comprised of a father, mother, son, and daughter. And they had a crane. And the blocks in this mausoleum weighed over 300 pounds each. And the front door over 2,000 pounds. And the mausoleum was made out of rose granite. And Wendy
I spent 2 years.
spent the time lining up the contracting firm, and we have a booklet of colored pictures showing the complete reconstruction. They took all the blocks down and rebuilt, and it is a magnificent mausoleum today. And not only is Ellen Dale inside interred, but C.D. Ives is too. And my son's ashes that died, his ashes are inside the mausoleum, and I have a key to it. Any other questions?
Well, I just want to thank you, Bill. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Very well.